Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Guide, the podcast guide to the history and heritage of the towns and cities of England, with a competitive twist. Whether you want to be primed for an upcoming trip, know more about England's towns, or gain a new perspective on where you live, this podcast is for you. Think of us, part guidebook, part companion, part battle of the towns. I'm Liam McGrath, and together with my old friend and co-host historian Daniel Gooch, we will discuss a town and rate it for interest, influence and importance in 4 topical areas. In this first episode, we're visiting the Midlands city of Coventry. In the first category, culture, we'll discuss Lady Godiva's naked ride through the city, the birth of two-tone, and Coventry's essential place in the history of British multiculturalism. In the second category, politics and war, we'll be talking the Blitz, the World Wars, and the turbulent period when Coventry was said to have acted as the capital of England. In the third category, science and industry, we'll hear how Coventry's rise and fall in car manufacturing gained it the label the Detroit of England. And finally, for urban heritage, we'll bring you the tale of 3 cathedrals, the not quite lost medieval heritage, and groundbreaking 20th century urban regeneration. So thank you for joining us, and we really hope you enjoy this first episode as we send you to Coventry. Today, Coventry is a large and superficially modern city located near the very centre of England. It's got well over 300,000 residents today, and it's in the West Midlands region, historically part of Warwickshire. Daniel, let's start from the beginning. What's the first evidence of the existence of Coventry?
Well, Coventry's actual origins as a town really are lost, but there has been archaeological evidence found of human remains in the centre of the modern city, carbon dated to the 800s. So it seems there was definitely some kind of settlement in Coventry by then. But I think really if you're going to talk about the start of Coventry as a major urban area, we have to start talking about Lady Godiva. Lady Godiva is probably a figure that you've heard of. We'll go into much more detail about her later, but she was a real person, and with her husband, Leofric of Mercia, the Saxon kingdom of Mercia, crucial in the foundation of Coventry as an important settlement, because they founded a monastery in the 11th century. It may actually be that the city was named after this monastery, from the word convent, tree being a Celtic word meaning town. But there's no question that this was the first time when Coventry really had a proper urban centre of political and ecclesiastical power. The next stop, I'd say, probably is 1345, when Coventry actually became a city. It was granted a Royal Charter of Incorporation by Edward III, and this is probably the height of Coventry's relative prosperity and power. It was, by modern estimates, about the 4th largest city in England by population, and others have said by prosperity and power. We have to put this into some kind of perspective. Although it was the 4th largest city in England, England was still very much a rural dwelling nation at the time. The population was still only about 5,000. Nowhere other than London was really particularly big, but it was still impressive in relative terms.
It's quite significant, though, that it's changed so much over the years, that the biggest and most significant towns in those days are very different from what we're used to today.
They are. I mean, the old medieval towns, which were major medieval places, were your Norwich, York, I suppose Lincoln, Bristol. And Norwich, York, Bristol and Coventry, I think, were all of broadly similar size around this time. But really, London's population was many times bigger, so there was absolutely no comparison between the metropolis and the provincial towns. And with Coventry specifically, it remained the largest city in the Midlands, really, I suppose, until the beginning of the 18th century, when Birmingham surpassed it. Birmingham's industrial growth, of course, during the Industrial Revolution caused it to become the second biggest city in the country. But there was industrial growth and a manufacturing boom in Coventry, and later on, there was a much bigger growth in the boundaries and the population of the city. Certainly in the 20th century, Coventry had one of the fastest population growth rates in England up until the 1960s. The population went from 70,000 in 1901 up to 305,000 in 1961 because it had rallied as an industrial centre in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the final thing to cover in this brief overview is probably the most famous episode in modern Coventry's history, the Blitz in 1940 to 1941, where several air raids by the German Air Force destroyed much of the city and really left a big mark in kind of the national cultural memory of the Second World War. And again, that's something we will talk about a lot more later on.
So we'll be talking a lot more about the industry that encouraged that immigration to Coventry and, of course, about the Blitz when we go through the sections. But now let's move on to our first category. We're going to start with culture. And where better to start than the legend of Lady Godiva, who many people will have heard of. But who was she, and what did she have to do with Coventry?
Well, I agree. We absolutely need to start with Lady Godiva, or Godgifu, as she was actually called. But
Godgifu.
Godgifu, but we'll go with Godiva
okay.
because she is better known as that, and I find it easier to pronounce, to be honest. So we'll stick with that. Now, Godiva is semi-legendary, and we'll come on to the legend in a minute, but she was a real person and very important historically, not just because of the endowment of the monastery in Coventry, which we spoke about earlier, but because really she was important in her own right. The Domesday Book records her as the only Saxon woman to remain a major landowner after the Norman conquest, the Domesday Book being the great record kept mainly for tax and inventory purposes of all the major landowners and their land in the country after the Norman conquest. But really, culturally, what we have to talk about is the legend of Lady Godiva and her naked ride through Coventry. So, Liam, have you ever bought a box of Godiva chocolates?
I have. Delicious.
Yeah. Have you ever
one of my favourites.
Have you ever looked at the logo on the front? Have you ever noticed that one?
I must admit, I've never zoomed in on the logo, I'll be honest.
Well, it's interesting. Godiva is a Turkish chocolate brand, yet they are not only named after Lady Godiva, their brand on the front is a picture of her riding naked on a horse through the streets of Coventry. Now, the legend here is that Godiva was married to, as we mentioned earlier, Leofric, who was Earl of the Saxon Kingdom of Mercia, with which Coventry was in. The legend was that Leofric was charging heavy taxes to the citizens of Coventry. Godiva pleaded on behalf of the townsfolk for him to reduce them, and he said, "I'll only reduce them if you ride naked through the streets of Coventry," presumably never expecting that she would, offering this daft wager that she wouldn't do it. And actually the legend goes that she did. Another facet to the legend is that of Peeping Tom, who supposedly was the only member of the populace of Coventry who actually looked out on Godiva as she rode through. The rest refused to look out of respect for what she was doing, and instantly Peeping Tom fell blind. So that's the legend. Liam, how true do you think this legend is?
I'm not optimistic. I think there is little truth in it.
It's low on the truthometer, you think?
That's right.
Low on the truthometer. Unfortunately, historians do agree that it's pretty definitely untrue. There's no mention of it in any sources at all until 2 centuries after Godiva died. Also, Coventry really was a tiny place at the time. I think its population in the Domesday Book was only about 350. So the ride really would have taken just a few seconds. It would have been like riding down a street or through a small village. But it's still a really important aspect of Coventry's historical culture, because really within Coventry itself, there have been festivals and processions reenacting and celebrating the event since the 1670s. It was reintroduced there and really is kind of this licentious cultural reawakening following the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II. But not just within Coventry, the legend of Lady Godiva has influenced many facets of modern popular culture. Various films have been made about her, historical novels feature her, poems, including one by Tennyson, and many songs about her as well, songs by Aerosmith, The Velvet Underground, Queen, and many others. So she really has put kind of Coventry on the map in a modern cultural sense, as well as giving it its own historical cultural legend.
And we've got this phrase, Peeping Tom, which many people in Britain will use, but without, well, I certainly didn't know the origins of it. And if you go to Coventry today, there's a little statue of Peeping Tom on top of one of the shopping arcades, and of course the Lady Godiva as well, that I think Pevsner described as tacky. So we've got Lady Godiva. Is there anyone else significantly influenced by Coventry?
Yeah, well, I think we have to jump forward a few hundred years now and talk about George Eliot. George Eliot, whose name was Mary Ann Evans, she wrote under a male pseudonym, is really one of the most important figures in English literary history. And she has a real connection, both in her life and her works, with Coventry. In her life, she lived in Foleshill, which is just on the outskirts of Coventry city centre today. Some of her earliest writing was published in a local newspaper there, the Coventry Herald and Observer. It was kind of this combination of satire, anonymous reviews, and criticism of local political figures. But most importantly, she actually just lived there during her formative years. She lived in Coventry from the age of 13 to 30. She was educated there before that. And while living there, she became involved with this kind of intellectual circle of radical free thinkers. One of them actually owned this newspaper that she wrote for, so provided this kind of conduit for her first experiences of writing for a mass audience. So it influenced her life, but Coventry also influenced her works. In Middlemarch, probably her most famous novel, it's been described as one of the greatest novels in the English language. This is set in a fictional Midlands town, which is pretty much definitely based on Coventry. I mean, one of the clues is that it's described as a ribbon manufacturing town. So you don't have to look too hard through that to see that it is based on Coventry. But also Adam Bede is another novel where Coventry was portrayed. She actually gave a pretty clear description of St Mary's Guildhall in the centre of the town. So really, George Eliot's life and works were fundamentally influenced by her time in Coventry.
Coventry is also known for a first in the world of theatre.
That's right. This is Ira Aldridge, who we need to talk about now. There really is a kind of an important, as you said, first there in Ira Aldridge, who is a figure who perhaps should be better known today, because in 1828, Ira Aldridge, who was an American, became the first black person to run a theatre in Britain. He'd actually also been, previous to that, the first black actor to play Othello in England. But it's been suggested more than that his presence in Coventry might have inspired local abolitionist petitions against the slave trade. So there is this kind of important theatrical first and the hints of this kind of broader influence that was wrought on Coventry in popular opinion by his presence there. And I think this kind of brings us on to kind of an amalgamation between culture and multicultural, multiracial politics in the 20th century to talk about two-tone music, which I know you're a big fan of, Liam.
Yes, we could not talk about Coventry and not talk about two-tone, which is the second generation of ska, the fast popular music branching from reggae with a strong offbeat. And although it originated in Jamaica in the 1950s and 60s, the second revival was in Coventry. And it started with a band called the Coventry Automatics, led by Jerry Dammers. And he basically got a group of his mates, as you say, representing that multiculturalism in Coventry. And that group went on to form the Specials, who are very well known in British musical history, and a musical scene in Coventry. The most well-known bands being the Selector and the Specials. And the Specials wrote music which sort of captured the feeling of that era. So this was the sort of the 70s, 80s period of industrial decline in Coventry. And the most well-known song is probably Ghost Town. And it really, to me, represents that blending of cultures that you had in Coventry that was as a result of its immigration, which ultimately came from its strong industry, which we'll talk about later.
And I think today, if you want to go to Coventry and actually kind of experience the heritage of two-tone, there is the Two-Tone Trail, which is a series of blue plaques marking important locations in the history of two-tone music, such as filming locations where the bands performed and rehearsed. There's also the Two-Tone Village, which is a shop and museum that you can go to learn more about it. So I think that's covered the main points on culture for Coventry. Should we do some scores?
We should do some scores. Do you know, Coventry, it surprised me. There was more there than I expected. I certainly didn't know so much about the significance of Godiva and George Eliot. And I do like the Specials. So I'm going to give Coventry, I'm going to give it a 6. I can't go any higher because I know we're going to go to cities where there's been entire music scenes and a huge scale international fame. But I think Coventry does quite well. I'm giving it a 6.
Yeah, that's a good score, certainly. 5 is the benchmark in this podcast for an average rating. I think you've hit on something important there, which is that Coventry kind of sits in the middle, musically speaking. We're not just talking about one or two bands, we are talking about an entire music scene. I suppose, though, if you compare it with the real big hitters in that respect, kind of Manchester music, heavy metal from Birmingham, it's a subgenre rather than something that actually revolutionised music on its own. So it's kind of in the middle in the rating system there. Godiva, though, certainly is nationally famous, and I think to some extent world famous as well. We talked about the fact she adorns a box of Turkish chocolates. International bands have recorded songs about her, films have been made about her. And George Eliot, really, we can't emphasise enough how important she is to the historical canon of English literature. It's perhaps, though, a shame that a bit more isn't made of her connections with the city in Coventry itself. You can visit her house. We went to see her house when we were there, but you can't go in or experience anything very much about her life there. But having said that, there's no doubting the importance of her time in Coventry to her life and works. So I'm going to go a bit lower. I'm going to go with a 4, but it's still a reasonable score.
Not a bad score. Now, Daniel, before we move on, I have to ask, what do we mean when we say we're sending someone to Coventry?
Sending someone to Coventry. Well, if I sent you to Coventry, Liam, if everyone else sent you to Coventry, it would just mean they'd stop talking to you. It's a phrase that just means you're going to stop talking to someone. It's a form of social ostracisation. And actually, no one knows what the origins of the phrase are. There's a source from the late 19th century saying it appears to have originated in the exclusion of military men at some period from the society of the respectable inhabitants, i.e. from sending soldiers to Coventry when they didn't really want to go there to get them out of the way. There's also a theory that it comes from the practice of sending misbehaving monks to the Coventry Charterhouse to be, for want of a better phrase, sorted out. So no one knows exactly where it came from. There's some interesting theories, but there's no question it's part of the English language today. It's certainly an idiom that I've used.
Not on me, I hope.
No, not on you, no. Absolutely
Given
not.
that we're recording a podcast.
No, it wouldn't be a very interesting podcast if I did.
Fantastic. Moving on to our next category then. It's political influence. And in this section, we talk about not just how the city has influenced British and international politics, but also military and battles. Now, when we went to Coventry, I didn't have in mind really much that we'd find in terms of political influence. And what have you found?
Well, if I told you that some people have made the argument that Coventry was once the capital city of England, would that surprise you?
Yes, it would.
It would. I think it would surprise a lot of people. But that's exactly what some people have argued, that Coventry was once the de facto capital city of Britain. I think to explain why we need to give a bit of context. This all occurred during the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses were a series of dynastic wars between competing branches of the English aristocracy for control of the English crown in the 15th century. What this led to was kind of a split in loyalties between different cities and different nobles across the country. And it led to the Lancastrian Queen, Margaret of Anjou, who was consort of King Henry VI, who was undergoing one of his bouts of mental illness at the time, moving the seat of Lancastrian power to Coventry in 1456. So effectively, Coventry became the centre of the Lancastrian centre of government for 3 years until 1459. Now, what this has meant really was the royal court was there, Parliament sat there, and so historians have made the argument that you would see Coventry as the centre of political power and therefore the de facto capital city of England at the time.
But lots of cities say this, don't they? Your hometown of Reading, I gather, claims to have been a seat of Parliament.
Well, it has been a seat of Parliament, but I think this is the crucial difference. It's absolutely right to say that parliaments were not just held in one place at this time. They were moved all the way around the country. Reading hosted several. They weren't just held in Westminster like they are today. I think the difference really is that Coventry acted as the consistent centre of the royal court as well as sitting parliaments for such an extended period of time. I wouldn't go overboard about it. Even if you did make this argument that it's the capital city, it would be capital in the sense that, say, Canberra or Dodoma are, rather than Sydney or Dar es Salaam, the seats of government and political power, rather than necessarily the largest or most influential city. But it's still quite a unique and interesting boast, I think, for the city.
And what about the city walls that you can see fragments of? Well, you can see the odd gatehouse in Coventry today. Are they significant?
Well, they were started in the 14th century. I think they finished in the early 16th. They are significant, I suppose, in as much as today they fit into the kind of architectural landscape of the city. They're built of red sandstone, which has been used in lots of buildings in Coventry. But I don't think they saw all that much military action. I think they were mostly destroyed in 1662 during the Restoration. Many gates were also torn down at the same time. But perhaps the more intriguing thing today than the walls, which we can still see fragments of, is Coventry Castle, because many towns and cities in this country have had castles at one point or another. This was built in 1140, built during a series of civil wars known as the Anarchy, and only used for a short time, like many castles around then. But the interesting thing about this is there is potentially a fragment of it remaining today, which is on the back of the Guildhall. This is this area known as the section of the building known as Caesar's Tower, and it's been speculated that could have been part of the entrance to Coventry Castle, and the Guildhall may even have used the castle's foundations. So I suppose, whereas Coventry didn't necessarily see a lot of, military siege action in itself, I think there was a 2-day unsuccessful royalist siege during the Civil War, but that's about it until the 20th century. It does create the kind of urban fabric of a militarised city, which you can still see fragments of today, which is really an interesting part of its heritage.
Moving forward to the 20th century, we need to talk in this section really about the contribution that cities have made to the national war effort. And Coventry really was pivotal in both world wars, wasn't it?
It was. If you're talking about contributions, Coventry, as we'll discuss in more detail in the next category, was really a major manufacturing town by the early 20th century. And this is really reflected in its contribution to the British armed forces and the contributions it made in respect of munitions and other equipment. The Triumph factory, which was located just next to the modern cathedral site, contributed 30,000 motorcycles to the British Army in the First World War. This is actually initially arranged by the company's founder, who was ironically a German named Siegfried Bettmann, who had previously been Coventry's mayor at the start of the war. There were 60,000 people working in its armaments factories. They made all sorts of things: massive naval guns, aircraft parts, cameras, bullets, plane chassis. In 1916, a newspaper report described it as the busiest town in England. So that really gives you some idea of the contribution it made during the First World War. But then I think if we move forward to the Second World War, there was still a massive manufacturing industrial contribution at that point. But I think what sticks in the British cultural memory today is what happened during the Blitz. The Blitz was a series of air raids across British urban centres during the Second World War by the German Air Force. Now, Coventry was targeted primarily because it was a major manufacturing industrial centre, but there are also theories that it was attacked because it had a great medieval building heritage at the time as well. So there was kind of a sapping the morale aspect to the attacks. But whatever the motivation behind it, the Blitz in Coventry caused pretty much as much destruction as was wrought on any other town or city in this country during the Second World War. There were several raids, but the main one was really on the 14th of November 1940, that night. The air raid sirens went off at 7 p.m. and went on all night. The all clear wasn't sounded until 6:15 in the morning. Over 500 bombers were involved, over 4,000 homes destroyed. The city's tram system was actually destroyed forever. The lines were ripped up or thrown into the air. Along with half of the city's buses, they were destroyed. And the tram system was never rebuilt after that. It was permanently destroyed. And most famously, Coventry's Gothic medieval cathedral, St Michael's, was really totally destroyed. The main lasting monument to the Blitz that you can see today is indeed that ruined medieval cathedral, and it's probably the most famous historical site in Coventry today. The old cathedral was never rebuilt. Instead, it was left as an open ruin and to act as the porch to the new modern cathedral of St Michael's, which we'll talk a little more about later on in our urban heritage section. But of course, we have to talk about the human cost as well. 554 people officially died that night, the 14th of November. But overall, more than 800 civilian victims died during the Blitz. Several of them are actually buried just in a mass grave in the London Road Cemetery. But I think when you go to Coventry, you do get that sense that it is remembered. The Blitz is an integral part of the cultural memory of the city, mainly through that cathedral, but also because of the War Memorial Park, which is just south of the station, and some of the living fragments that are there at the moment. There's a barrage balloon anchorage, an entrance to an air raid shelter, and the memorials that are there now.
I think what really sets Coventry's destruction apart from many other cities, particularly in this country, is that the city centre and its cathedral were so obliterated. So if we look at many of the cities that were bombed in Britain, it tended to be naval areas, industrial areas. You think of the bombing of London, the East End and the docks, or Plymouth and Hull, its dock areas, whereas Coventry, it feels like it really was the heart and soul of the city, ultimately led to its, or contributed to its major rebuilding. So at this point, I think it's time to give a score for the contribution of Coventry in this category. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts on this, I think it's going to be a strong score. I think it ticks the boxes, certainly of military history, because although when we think of British military history, we tend to think of great medieval battles and sieges. I think this adds a different aspect to it, the impact of modern 20th century warfare and how destructive that can be on an urban community. But there's not just the destruction, there's also the contribution that the city made as well. These massive contributions during both world wars to the armed forces and their supplies and their efforts during the war. When it comes to the political side of things, we shouldn't over-egg the claim that it was the de facto capital of the country, because this was only for 3 years. It is a bit of a tenuous claim if we're really being brutally honest about it. But it is actually, its role in the Wars of the Roses is actually immortalised in Shakespeare, which is something we didn't touch on before, but there's a famous scene from Shakespeare's Richard II, which takes place on the outskirts of Coventry. So it does emphasise that it was an important part of the national political life at that time. Overall, it has the heritage today of St Michael's Cathedral, which was during the war. It has the heritage of the city walls, which are still there in part. There's still things you can see there today which will remind you of the past in a very real and, in one case, very poignant way. So for me, it's going to be a reasonably positive score. It's going to be 6 again.
I think that's right. The capital city, although interesting and surprising, I don't think that will come too much into my score. We cannot deny the enormous contribution in terms of armaments that Coventry provided. I'm also inclined to give Coventry a good score. I'm going to give it a 6 as well. Well, we're moving on to the science and industry category here. And this is where I think Coventry is really well known for its car industry, which is legendary all over the world. But Daniel, where did this car industry come from? How did Coventry come to be this big centre of car manufacturing?
I think what you have to see in Coventry is a progression of different trades, and trades which built on the skills that were developed in the city in prior trades. So if we go back to, say, the Middle Ages, the woolen trade and the cloth trade were quite important to Coventry's economy, Coventry's industry. This wasn't industry in kind of the modern mechanised production sense, of course. Plus, as we mentioned earlier, Coventry was just a much smaller place, as all urban areas were at the time, so we shouldn't over-egg this. Really, the first kind of industry in any kind of modern sense was the silk ribbon trade in the 18th century. The demand for this came from changing personal tastes during the Napoleonic Wars, and the market was kind of augmented by tariffs on overseas imports from the cheaper products produced in Europe. There was previously kind of an overseas trade, particularly with the American colonies before the American Revolutionary War. But Coventry was heavily reliant on this. A huge number of people in the city, massive percentage, actually worked in the silk ribbon trade. I think at one point in the 18th century, or the early 19th century, 10,000 out of a population of about 16,000 in the city actually was estimated to have worked in the silk ribbon trade, and lots of women as well. But really what did for the silk ribbon trade in Coventry is something that's pretty topical today. It was a free trade agreement. This was the Cobden Treaty. Now, the Cobden Treaty was important because it was one of the country's first free trade agreements, which led to the cutting of tariffs between Britain and France. What this and other subsequent free trade agreements meant was that these cheaper products that were manufactured within Europe could suddenly flood the market in the UK and undercut the prices of Coventry's silk ribbon production. Now, the problem for Coventry here was that it had become really, I think you say, overly specialised, overly reliant on this one single particular industry. So when this happened, when the bottom fell out of the market, this really did lead to absolute economic ruin for the town. By 1862, which was only 2 years after the Cobden Treaty was signed, up to 4,000 weavers and their families were said to have left for northern textile towns or simply left the country and emigrated. 800 houses were empty, and very few firms survived as a result of this.
I think the impact of tariffs and diplomacy and international trade is a common theme we'll come across in our exploration of English towns and indeed industrial towns across the world. Moving on from the ribbon trade, Coventry moved on to more heavy industrial centre. And what really was the genesis of that?
I suppose you could see the genesis in the clockmaking industry, which really coexisted with the silk ribbon trade. Now, important point about the silk ribbon trade, it was never really kind of a modern mechanised industry. I think steam power was introduced only in the late 1830s, which was very late for an industry like this. And clockmaking also was a very specialised niche artisan industry. But what it led to was the development of specific particular skills. These skills were built on by the bike manufacturing industry, which was introduced into Coventry in 1868. Now, there is a real link from the bike manufacturing industry in Coventry to the modern day, because I know, Liam, you're a keen bike rider, but I've ridden plenty of bikes.
Bikes I own and ride look nothing like the bikes being made in 19th century Coventry.
Well, you might be surprised, because actually pretty much anyone who owns a bike today, if it's not some kind of penny farthing or antique equivalent, the template, the design for their bike came from Coventry. It's known as the safety bicycle. That design of having two wheels, brakes, being able to put your feet on the ground and stop yourself from moving, that's the safety element. That design came from Coventry.
I must admit, Daniel, I found it quite remarkable when I visited the Coventry Transport Museum, which, by the way, has the biggest collection of historic bikes you'll ever see. There's just seemingly hundreds of different bikes. It really did strike me that the designs of bikes before the safety bicycle, as it was known, they really looked terribly unsafe. And you hear all these stories about the inability to stop the bike, the great height from which you'd fall from a penny farthing. But it's absolutely fascinating to see how the character of the humble bicycle changed over the years, and so much of the innovation happened in Coventry.
Absolutely, it did. The first commercially successful safety bicycle came out of Coventry in 1885, so it only took 17 years for the introduction of the bicycle manufacturing industry in Coventry for the safety bicycle, the modern template design that we still use today, to come out of that industry. So really there's a fascinating link between 19th century Coventry industry and the most used form of personal transportation in the world today.
And of course, we shouldn't understate the relevance of bikes to personal freedom. It was the first time you could really move of your own volition at quite a decent speed and sort of get away from perhaps places that you wouldn't want to be. So really influential innovation. And I suppose from push bikes, logically, you put an engine on it and you get the motorbikes, the motorbikes that we talked about in section on the First World War. How did we get from those push bikes to the motorbikes through that heavier industry in Coventry?
Well, I think what we have to talk about here is kind of the next natural progression in those steps, which is the car industry, which is probably the one industry that Coventry is most famous for today in its history. I think one phrase probably sums Coventry up in the early 20th century: Britain's Detroit. Because with only two exceptions, every mass car manufacturer with a presence in Britain had a presence in Coventry. There was a motorbike factory, a huge one right next to, as I mentioned earlier, the site of the new cathedral. But car manufacturing came to Coventry on the back of this. From 1896, when the Daimler manufacture was set up there, the rights to the Daimler name were bought from German firms. And what Daimler produced was kind of, as well as cars for the mass market, prestige cars as well. It was the official car supplier to the monarch under royal warrant from 1902 to the 1950s. In fact, the Daimler factory had its own station on the Coventry to Nuneaton line just outside the city centre, Daimler Holt. It was built in 1917, only used by factory employees. Only factory employees were actually allowed to use the station until 1956. It closed in 1965. There is unfortunately nothing there now, but it really does show you just how important and vast that one single manufacturing plant was to Coventry.
And I think the Coventry car making industry really reflects the mass car making industry of the UK as a whole. As the UK car industry became, I think it was the world's second largest exporter at one point, Coventry was at the heart of that. And, you know, when it had a resurgence in the late 20th century, I think a Peugeot model was made there. Coventry was at the heart of it. But you mentioned the expression Britain's Detroit. That phrase has two elements to it, doesn't it? It signifies it being the centre of the car industry, just as Detroit was, but it also alludes to the decline of the industry and the effect that had on the city and its urban fabric.
I think that's a really good summing up of it. The car industry, I think, still exists in some form in Coventry. There is a manufacturer there, I think, today.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah. It tends to be more high-end manufacturing. So Jaguar and London taxis, the electric taxis. And if you go to the Transport Museum, I'll plug it again because I really do think it's excellent. It's got a whole section on the modern car manufacturers and all the innovations that they're making.
Should we do some scores, do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think Coventry's going to do well in this round. I
think it is. I think if you're going to nitpick on the history, you would certainly say that the Coventry has a history of over-reliance on specific industries. And we saw with the silk ribbon trade, this did lead to real ruin for the city when the bottom fell out of that market. But really later on, there was this clear progression between different industries and the use of transferable skills. The point with bike manufacturing is bike manufacturing was set up in Coventry because the skills already existed there from the clockmaking industry, from this smaller artisan trade that was previously there. And even if it isn't quite the manufacturing industrial centre that it used to be, the legacy of the industry is still with us today, not just in the museums like the Coventry Transport Museum, which I gather you really loved when you went there, Liam.
Yeah, I did. I thought it was fantastic. Highly recommended.
Despite the lack of trains.
There were no trains. That's the only thing. There's numerous bikes and hundreds of cars, but not a train or a tram in sight. I think there was one bus.
So yeah, the legacy is there. You know, not just in that museum, in the presentation of heritage today, but also in that design of the modern safety bicycle, the most used form of transportation in the world today. There are over 1 billion bikes in the world, far more than there are cars, and they're all built to that Coventry safety bicycle design. So I think there is a lot there for Coventry. So I'm going to give it an 8.
Wow, that is a good score, and I tend to agree. I mean, it's had such an influence, and I think, as you say, there's not much left in the heritage of the city, although you could argue that the ring road, the big dual carriageway that circles around the city centre like a Scalextric, is sort of a legacy of Coventry's car manufacturing, as it was I think it was the city with the highest car ownership at the time of its construction, 1950s onwards, and other legacies in its immigrant population, because of course, whenever there's a successful industry with lots of well-paid jobs, it attracts thousands of people, and people are attracted from around the British Empire, from Ireland. That legacy is still there. and has been through, as we've discussed, the two-tone and its multiculturalism. I think we cannot escape that Coventry has been one of the most successful exporting cities in modern British history, and the statistics are incredible, whether it's the 450 bicycle makers in the city, or the as you said, the fact that virtually every mass-produced car company had a presence in Coventry. I think I have to also give it a high score. So I'm also going to give it an 8. I think it will be one of our highest scorers in this category, undeniably.
If they'd put a train in the Transport Museum, would that have got it a 9?
10 out of 10.
We should suggest that to Coventry Tourist Board.
I will. Yes. So yes, do please visit the Transport Museum if you find yourself in Coventry. And we have, of course, on our website got a map of all the places we visited, including the Transport Museum. And Daimler Holt, didn't we visit Daimler Holt?
I think it's actually Daimler. A Coventryman told me off for saying Daimler.
Sorry.
We had feedback on this.
Thank you for that feedback. Daimler Holt, I think we went there and there wasn't a lot there.
Nothing there, no.
No, okay. But we had a nice walk.
We did. There was a pub nearby, I think.
Talking of nice walks, we're now on to the architecture and urban heritage. And there's a great story here, isn't there? Tell us what you've picked out as the story, really, of Coventry's architecture and urban heritage.
I think I would frame Coventry's urban heritage, you could almost frame its entire urban history, as being a tale of 3 cathedrals. Now, when I say 3 cathedrals, does that surprise you, Liam?
Yes, it does, because I think many people will know about the bombed-out cathedral and the modern cathedral. But what's this third cathedral?
Third cathedral is Coventry's original cathedral, St Mary's Priory and Cathedral, which was that monastery that we mentioned earlier that was endowed by Godiva and Leofric, which gave Coventry its earliest political and ecclesiastical nucleus. This was a cathedral for quite some time, from the early 12th century until the dissolution of the monasteries under the reign of Henry VIII, when the English church broke from Rome, and the church, which led to the foundation of the Church of England later on. Interestingly, it was the only cathedral that was actually destroyed in the dissolution of the monasteries. There was no actual reason why a cathedral had to be destroyed. It's just the seat of power was moved to, I think it was Lichfield, a different ecclesiastical building, where the monks there were, I think, slightly more amenable to Henry VIII's whims and political leanings. So what you have today from St Mary's Cathedral is a small ruined area in the centre of the city. There was some archaeological excavations in recent years. Time Team, the Channel 4 programme, went there. They actually extended their first dig and went back a second time, broke all their rules because there was so much that was there to find. And really, this is one of the main kind of modern, tangible emblems of Coventry's significant medieval history, along with the other specks that you see dotted about of medieval buildings that are within the city centre. And what were your thoughts, Liam, on the kind of the medieval architectural heritage of Coventry, the old buildings that we saw?
I thought the buildings that were remaining were absolutely beautiful in their detail, and I think it's fantastic they've been preserved. I gather some of them have been moved, so I think the collection of these medieval buildings on Spon Street have actually been moved from Much Park Street up. These are beautiful buildings. The difficulty, I suppose, is the context has gone. The wider urban context of Coventry doesn't feel medieval anymore. So whilst these are wonderful buildings in themselves, they perhaps look somewhat out of place.
Well, it's interesting that we can look back on lots of travel writing and travel writers' opinions on Coventry throughout the centuries, and anything pretty much before the 20th century describes just how ancient and medieval and quaint looking the city was. A sample of that would be Thomas Pennant writing in 1811, describing Coventry as a great and ancient city. The streets in general are narrow, composed of very ancient buildings, the stories of which in some impend one over the other in such a manner as to nearly meet at the top. So what you're what we're picturing here is something like, say, the shambles in York, when you've got those multi-stories buildings protruding towards each other and leaning towards each other as they go above you. That's really the kind of medieval city it was.
It sounds more like York or Norwich, doesn't it, than Coventry. I don't think anyone would apply that description to Coventry today.
I don't think they would. And if you look at those buildings on Spon Street, what they really signify is this attempt at, to my mind, locking the stable door after the horse has bolted almost, trying to preserve the medieval heritage in some way, but so much 20th century redevelopment before and after the Second World War has destroyed so much of what was there. But I think that leads us neatly on to talking about the next stage, which is the second cathedral, which is what is now known as Coventry's Old Cathedral, or sometimes Coventry's Medieval Cathedral, which is St Michael's. Now, St Michael's Cathedral is that cathedral which we spoke about earlier, which was destroyed during the Blitz. One of the really fascinating things about that is, although it's a medieval building, it wasn't actually made a cathedral until 1918. So it was only actually standing as a cathedral for 22 years, despite this impression of it being this great medieval building, which it was. It was still much smaller than St Mary's, significantly smaller in size than the original cathedral. But the redevelopment of St Michael's today as a porch to the new cathedral is really kind of significant in people's perception of Coventry and its urban heritage to this day, because that leads us on to talking about the third cathedral, the post-war cathedral. The most important thing about the new cathedral, I think, is it's the way it stands as the centrepiece, even if not geographically, then thematically, for the post-war city centre redesign of Coventry. It's an unashamedly modernist design, and that really is quite unique amongst Church of England cathedrals in this country. I mean, how many Anglican cathedrals in this country are not built to a Gothic or a neo-Gothic design? Probably St Paul's with this English Baroque design, I think Guildford, and those are the only ones that spring to mind for me. And really what this signifies is this kind of bold new template design that Coventry had for urban city centre redevelopment in the mid-20th century and after the Second World War. Because Coventry is a totally redesigned new planned city. And not just that, but it acted as the template for other city centre redesigns post-war. What's quite interesting about this is it's thought of as being purely a post-war redesign, a post-war project, but actually there were already plenty of plans in place for the redesign of Coventry before the Second World War. There were significant plans advertised actually in 1940, advertised publicly the same year that the Blitz struck and destroyed so much of the city centre. It's more that the Blitz kind of augmented, hurried up, radicalised the plans, if you like, if that's the best word for it, that were already in place for the redevelopment of the city centre. And it's that fact that Coventry stood as that template for so much of the rest of the country's redesign and its urban scenery after the Second World War, which I think is really significant about it.
This was the city architect and planner Donald Gibson, and what he's done, and you can see virtually all of this still remaining in Coventry today, is planned the city around a series of multi-levelled precincts. And I think while some of it today could be described as faded, although I think some of it is being improved as we speak, it really does show a purity in its style and design. For example, there's a axis, a vista, that cuts across from a very modernist tower block at one end to the spire of the old St Michael's Cathedral at the other end. And then along that axis is this large square bounded on three sides by modernist buildings, one of which is a large department store. I think it was an Owen at some point, now a Primark. And on the other side, Broadgate House, which was built in, I think, around 1950, and clearly a very architecturally progressive construction.
Individual modules were used for different shops. You had different compartments of the building, essentially acting as individual shops for individual shop owners. And actually, the modules were provided in priority to those shop owners whose shops had been destroyed during the Blitz.
I want to say a few more words about the cathedral, though, before we do the scoring, Daniel, because I think there's some elements of its contribution to design, or at least the presentation of the design of its time beyond architecture. So You've got, for example, a huge tapestry hung inside, which some have said is the world's largest, by Graham Sutherland. It's got a series of quite well-known statues. We've got the bold baptistery, and the stained glass window really is quite breathtaking. If you walk along the cathedral nave and you look back, and there's these wonderfully arranged, I think it's 195 panes of modern glass in a very modern style, and it's presented alongside connections with the old cathedral. And there's these poignant elements of it. One of the crosses in the cathedral is made from wood from the old cathedral. In fact, the nails were donated from the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church in Berlin, which is the bombed out cathedral in a church in West Berlin. So the cathedral evokes very much the design of its period, not just in its architectural presentation, but also its presentation of artefacts and integration with the city.
And what I'd say about the overall design and maintenance of the cathedral is it presents kind of a challenge to modern thinking around modernist architectural design amongst, I think, kind of public thought. I think modernist design gets a bad press these days, and much of that stems from the fact that modernist architecture is generally a bit uncared for, much like Victorian architecture was not loved in the post-war period because that was uncared for, dark, sooty and dirty and crumbling. But what Coventry's new cathedral shows you, it's not just one of the kind of most unique and intriguing buildings, for my money, in the whole country, but it shows you that modernist era of architectural history, if it is well cared for and it's well maintained, can be just as interesting, just as affecting, and just as stunning and just as impressive aesthetically in every way as any other design style of architecture that there is.
I think that's right, and Coventry really presents that issue very clearly. The area around the cathedral, around the civic centre there, the university, has been well maintained and well presented. Perhaps the shopping precincts less so. And I think this really brings me on to my scoring for Coventry, because I find that modernist architecture, particularly on the scale that you see it in Coventry, across Coventry, in its precincts and in its civic structures, I find that impressive. Even the railway station has that modernist architecture. But to me, the way that it blends into that old medieval arrangement and those fragments of buildings that remain lets it down. You've got one or two streets where that integration is done well. I'm thinking around the side of St. Michael's, next to the Guildhall. But really, you feel that the presentation of many of those older buildings is not well done. They're sort of juxtaposed in the concrete jungle, and I'm not keen on the presentation of Spon Street. So I wish I could give Coventry a score based on either of those elements of its history, but that's just not how it is. So despite all of these fascinating features, I give Coventry a 6.
Okay, well, 6 is still a good score. My thoughts, I think I agree with what you're saying on the presentation of kind of the medieval heritage. It's there. Some of the individual buildings, such as the Chapel of St John's Hospital, Ford's Hospital, are really fascinating and interesting on their own. But aside from that one area around the 3 cathedrals and the civic buildings around there isn't really kind of a sense of a unified whole in the presentation of Coventry's heritage. I'd even probably go so far as to say that some of Spon Street actually looks a little bit tacky where the buildings were moved to. Some of the presentation of the buildings are not particularly favourable to their heritage. But I'd say you can't deny that the cathedrals, as I said at the beginning, are integral to the heritage and the history of Coventry. The city centre itself is a living historical template, and this juxtaposition of the 3 different kinds, the three different stages of architectural design of cathedral and even ruin of cathedral are really emblematic of that. The city itself, in its redesign post-Second World War, is emblematic, really, of a crucial time in the country's rebuilding. You could even see it as pioneering. David Canaston, the famous modern historian, described Coventry's city centre urban redesign as the national flagship of reconstruction. And really many of its buildings did set kind of the tone for urban redevelopment post-war. I think really what that means for me is that you have to separate different elements: the history, the historical importance, and the heritage. I think for historical importance, I'm going to give it a good score. I think for the heritage presentation element of it, it's a middling score, because you've got that divergence between what it does well, the cathedrals, what's not quite so good, and what's been lost really as part of 20th century development. But for me, it's still a positive score just because of how unique and interesting so much of its redesign is, particularly around the cathedral. So for me, it's going to be a 6.5.
Fantastic. Moving on to our final category, my favourite category as it happens, reality versus expectations. And this really gets to the heart of the podcast. It gets to the heart of what we're doing, exploring towns and cities and getting under the skin and really trying to find new things that we hadn't expected. And I felt with our trip to Coventry, there was so much that I learned that I didn't know about. Some things more significant than others. So I didn't know that it was the capital, and I didn't know much about Lady Godiva. But the things that really impressed me were around the transport industry and bicycles, the cars, that and the architecture and heritage. And in those two areas, it vastly exceeded my expectations, particularly because, frankly, if you say to someone you're going to Coventry to look at the architecture, you often get a puzzled look. I don't think people that haven't been there would necessarily associate it with architecture and heritage. So on reality versus expectations, I'm giving it a good score. I'm giving it a 7.
Well, I think absolutely right. If you said to someone you were going to Coventry to look at the buildings, they might think at worst you're a little bit peculiar, to be honest, or you have some kind of fascinating niche interest in modern concrete jungles. But I think there is definitely so much more to it than that. Reality versus expectations is really crucial for a place like Coventry, which may not have the greatest historical reputation in this country for the way it's presented today or its historical importance. But there's no doubt that it ticks every box there, except perhaps culture, but it's still got a reasonable score for culture and its connections to Lady Godiva and George Eliot. I think it presents some aspects of its history very well. The Transport Museum, the juxtaposition of all three cathedrals is really unique. I suppose it's perhaps a shame that more thought didn't go into preserving the medieval architecture a bit better in the early and mid-20th century. But I suppose moving beyond that, if you're looking at the 20th century in its intangible heritage, it has its unique place in British cultural memory. The impact of the Blitz was felt strongly in Coventry and preserved as well in memory with the construction of the new cathedral and preservation of the ruin of the old cathedral as in any other part of the country. And of course, it has that lasting impact on the whole world, the design of the modern safety bicycle. These are all things that I don't think anyone would generally know about Coventry or associate with the history of the town. So I think it's going to be positive for me. For me, Coventry gets a 6.5.
Not a bad score at all. Time to top up the scores. And where are we for Coventry?
You're going to have to remind me what your reality versus expectations score is. I forgot to put it in.
7.
7. I thought it was 7, honest. Okay, so totals: political and military influence 12, industry 16, art and culture 10, architectural and urban heritage 12.5, reality versus expectations 13.5. That is a total of 64 out of 100 for Coventry. That is a very good score. And Coventry goes top of the league and technically bottom of the league because it's just Coventry in the league at the moment. Right, well, that was a fun episode to record. Really good talking about Coventry. Really deep and interesting and varied history there. But now it's time for the fun bit. The fun bit, Liam, where we turn the tables round and I get to quiz you.
Oh, no.
Just a bit of fun. Don't worry, just a very quick quiz. Just to finish off, we're going to have a quiz at the end of the episode that's vaguely related to the kind of topics of the city we've just discussed. And today, as we've just been discussing Coventry, we're going to have a quiz on the cathedrals of the UK. Quiz question for you today, Liam, is: can you name the 5 largest cathedrals in the UK by interior area? So by interior area, we mean the floor space covered, not height, not volume, specifically interior area. I'll take the answers in any order, but you get 5 guesses to name as many as you can.
Okay. I'm going to start. St. Paul's Cathedral.
St. Paul's Cathedral, absolutely right.
Yes.
Second on the list, 7,875 square St Paul's, which of course is in the English Baroque style, replaced the old Gothic St Paul's when it was gutted in the Great Fire of London in 1666.
Now you said an interesting thing to me, Daniel. You said that St Paul's was the only cathedral in that style. I think when we
the
walked
English
around.
Baroque style. In this country, it's the only Anglican cathedral that I'm aware of. Certainly in the broader neoclassical style, because they tend to be Gothic or neo-Gothic. Not always. We actually have one, and a bit of a clue for you, another one on this list which is not quite in the Gothic style. But I won't give it away.
Okay, right. So I think that was the easy one. Now I'm going to struggle. But I think I know the longest, and its length therefore might mean it's got a high floor area. So I'm going to go for Winchester.
I'm afraid Winchester Cathedral is not on the list. No, 1 out of 2.
Okay, I'm going to go back then to Liverpool, the Liverpool Anglican Cathedral.
Liverpool Anglican Cathedral, absolutely right. It's number 1, top of the list. 9,687 square metres. It's actually the 7th largest in the world and the 2nd largest Anglican cathedral in the world.
Wow.
And
but it's enormous.
I think it's actually the longest cathedral in the world. There's, longest Anglican cathedral in the world, as well as the 2nd largest Anglican cathedral in the world. There's a few Catholic cathedrals which are longer, but not many.
Wow, it does tower over. I'm looking forward to the Liverpool episode, and I'm going to go with York Minster.
York Minster. You've completed the top 3 there. York Minster is 3rd. Lots of people think it's not a cathedral because of the name. It is a cathedral. Minster's kind of a symbolic title that was given to Saxon missionary churches. But yeah, it's the largest Gothic as opposed to neo-Gothic cathedral in England, and actually one of the largest in Northern Europe.
Wow. Again, it towers over York.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Beautiful building. Beautiful city. Looking forward to that episode.
Yes, so.
I know it's a very tall cathedral, but is it big floor area? I'm going to go for it anyway. I'm going to go for Norwich.
Not Norwich, no. It is a very tall cathedral, you're right. I think 2nd tallest in England after Salisbury, possibly. I haven't checked that, but I think it is. So, the last 2. I'll go in reverse order. 5th largest is Lincoln Cathedral, roughly
I was thinking,
5 square
I was
kilometres.
tempted by Lincoln.
Well, the most interesting fact about Lincoln Cathedral is it was the tallest building in the world, of course, for a couple of 100 years, from 1311 to 1549, until its spire fell off. It was actually the tallest building that had ever been constructed until 1890.
Wow.
So for 300 years, over 300 years after the spire fell off, no one built a building that was taller than that. And it was the first non-ancient building to be the tallest structure in the world, because up until that point, the Great Pyramid of Giza, which had been the tallest building in the world for nearly 4,000 years, had the record. So all sorts of amazing facts about Lincoln Cathedral.
Incredible.
Incredible. It's 5th on this list.
Ah.
And the 4th one, so 4th on the list, last one overall, a bit of an unusual one here, Westminster Cathedral, not the Abbey. Don't get the two confused. Westminster Cathedral. It's the largest Catholic cathedral in the UK and the mother cathedral of the UK Catholic Church. And this is the one that I was saying isn't in a Gothic style. It's a Neo-Byzantine style. It's much more kind of colourful and rounded and richly decorated once you go in there. Certainly much more colourful than we're used to seeing in cathedrals in the UK. So really interesting and unique building.
A lovely cathedral, and underrated, I think. When people visit London, they'll go to Westminster Abbey, but they don't walk down the street to Westminster Cathedral. But it's well worth seeing.
No, absolutely. So well done, 3 out of 5. That's not too bad.
I can live with 3.
It's an honourable mention.
I sense it's going to go downhill from here.
We'll see.
We'll see.
Thanks very much for joining us. Where are we off to next, Liam, on our next podcast?
The next podcast episode is Reading. And thank you for joining us on Ye Olde Guide. We have extensive information with all that we've discussed about Coventry and much more on our website, yeoldeguide.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a review and rating on your podcast provider, and of course get in touch with us via the website or Twitter. Let us know what you thought about the podcast, what we've missed, and where we should visit later in the series. Thank you for listening.